Now, just imagine a young boy who grew up on the wrong side of the border. His family wasn't wealthy or connected, but that boy never stopped believing in himself. He emigrated to a new country and pulled himself up by his bootstraps to become the most famous leader that country has ever known. That boy was Adolf Hitler, and he destroyed that country. Boo! Oh, everyone likes a rags to riches story until it's Hitler. For real, it does sound like a story made in Hollywood. If it had happened here, it would be the definition of the American dream, except for the Holocaust. The Holocaust was actually one of the worst things that has ever happened. And it's not a competition among atrocities, by the way, but the Holocaust was more wicked than anything we could ever imagine. The stories don't give justice to just how terrible it was. If there weren't for pictures and thousands of firsthand accounts, people wouldn't believe something that bad could happen. In fact, that is why Eisenhower insisted that GIs come and visit the camps, because he was like, no one is ever going to believe this. Now, I hate the Holocaust, of course, but I love a hero's journey. So here we are. Now, on April 20th, which is in just a few days, it will be Hitler's 136th birthday. And a few days after that, about a week after that, it will mark 80 years since his death. 80 years since his death. And about a week later, it's 80 years since Victory in Europe Day, which is the fall of the Third Reich and the end of the Aryan Dream. Now, we respect the 80-year mark on this channel because it is about the lifespan of one person. And all of the old timers who could tell us about those days from firsthand knowledge have just about died off, unfortunately. So there are very few living people who actually remember what went down. So for the next few weeks, I'm going to be doing videos on Hitler, on the Nazis, and how regular people could have possibly gone along with this insanity. I will link you to Holocaust videos so that you can watch them. It's just too horrific for me to cover, especially the way I cover things. And I'm really not going to spend hours crying about the cruelty of what went down there. We'll touch on it later in later videos just to let you know exactly what happened and how ordinary people were able to participate in this. And I'll suggest some movies, but I just can't do justice to the horrors that were the Holocaust. And I will link firsthand testimonies. I will link other things below so that you can go and watch them. Now, Hitler has been getting a bit of a revival recently. Maybe it's because it's been so long and people don't really remember the stories anymore. Maybe it's because AI can now translate his speeches into English so we can listen to them in his voice the way Germans would have been hearing them. Now, there has been some fangirling of Hitler on the right-wing fringes recently, and you might be thinking, well, maybe this Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. You know, our elites lie to us all the time. Maybe they're lying to us about him. No, let me dissuade you from any sympathy you might have for that man. Even if you're looking for a strong man to admire, which you shouldn't be, but if you are, Hitler is not the guy. If you need a 20th century strongman to worship, which you shouldn't, I would suggest Franco of Spain. He's better. Better yet, don't worship any of them. Really, don't worship any of them. But if you must worship a fascist, even Mussolini is better than Hitler. Hitler was the ultimate evil. If you're getting convinced by his AI speeches that he was anything else, it's actually your failure to recognize evil and not that all of the historians were wrong about him. Hitler started a war that caused the deaths of between 25 and 40 million people in Europe. Now, I get that there are militaristic cultures where the death of your enemy is actually a good thing, but Hitler betrayed his own people, too. He betrayed his own people. After he was beaten, he wanted to take Germany down with him, like Jim Jones did in Guyana. But Albert Speer, he did not go along with Hitler's orders to destroy the German infrastructure. Hitler's love for Germans, it was just another kind of narcissism. Like, if I can't have them, no one else will, or they are an extension of me. They're not their own people. So he led the Germans into ruin, which is why it is crazy to me, absolutely crazy, that neo-Nazis worship him. If there ever was true evil, it was Adolf Hitler. And we're going to go into it more in other videos, but this revivalism that there is going on about Hitler is just Looney Tunes. However, he was a fascinating man, absolutely fascinating. How this man, this young boy who didn't even finish high school, who came from a modest family, who served as a lowly corporal, in the German army in the First World War, how he was able to rise to the top of the German government and wreak havoc over the entire globe. He ruled over German aristocrats and forced German people to do his bidding, and he wasn't even German. He was Austrian. That's a bit nitpicky, but it kind of matters. It does come up later. When people compare Trump to Hitler, I actually get offended because that is like comparing a circus tumbler to Simone Biles. You put some respect on Hitler's name. He was a once in a millennium kind of monster. And he did it by playing the attention game. He made himself on charisma. He was charismatic. That's right. Hitler was an influencer. He might not have been the first influencer, but he was the greatest that there ever was. So in this video, I'm going to give you a brief history of Hitler's life, very brief, of his life and early career, an overview of how he used the media of his day to rise to the top. Why were Germans so receptive to Hitler's message? And also, how did he actually translate the attention that he was getting into real power? The main sources I'm going to use for this are, of course, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, Hitler's old speeches, now on AI, and I'm not going to be playing any of them for you. I will not. And his autobiography, Mein Kampf. If I use another source, I will put that on the screen. Luckily, I don't think influencers of today have the attention span to pull off what Hitler did. And the American government isn't really structured the same way that the German government was structured in the 1920s and 1930s. So it would be much more difficult here. Much more difficult. Not impossible, but much more difficult. Plus, most of today's influencers are audience captured, and Hitler was the one who captured his audience, not the other way around. Still, it's interesting to see how new technologies spawned an epic influencer and how that man damn near destroyed the whole world. We always want to root for the little guy, but what if that little guy is Adolf Hitler? Then no, we don't root for him. Absolutely not. A brief history of Hitler's life. Hitler was born of Austrian peasant stock, as they would say it back then. Of course, we don't say that now. But that makes very little sense to us Americans who are all peasant stock or claim to all be peasant stock. But in an aristocratic society, that meant that he was born with no seat at the table. If you were born in 1789 and not 1889, we may have never heard of Adolf Hitler. He would have been too far away from power. But the world fundamentally changed when Hitler was a young man. So, by accident of fate, this little pipsqueak from Austria was able to rise to the absolute heights. He was born on April 20th, 1889 in the town of Braunau am Inn, just over the border from Bavaria and Austria. It's an hour 20 to Munich, driving from there. So yes, he was Austrian and not German, but come on, it's right over the border. So one thing Americans also have to understand about Europe is that it's pretty small. It takes longer to drive from Los Angeles to New York than it takes to drive from Paris to Moscow. And in that small place, they have killed millions upon millions of each other, century after century. And I understand why European Americans' ancestors left. Just take note of how barbaric and insane European history actually is. And don't be fooled by their baguettes and their high-speed rails and their little wooden shoes, okay? No. That might seem like a tangent, but it really does matter to this story and any understanding of Europe, really. Adolf Hitler was of lowly birth. He was the third son of a minor Austrian customs official who had himself been an illegitimate child. His mother and father were second cousins, and because they were so closely related, they needed to get special permission from a bishop so that they could marry. His mother's people had been attached to their land. So they stayed in the same spot for 4 generations. But his father's people were wanderers. Adolf Hitler was very close to being Adolf Schicklgruber. And let's just agree that Schicklgruber doesn't roll off the tongue like Hitler. The potential from branding just isn't there. No one's giving a Heil Schicklgruber. Alois Hitler was his father, and Clara Purzel was his mother, and they were family. Her grandfather was his uncle and had raised him, so this was kind of an incestuous relationship. Clara was also Alois' third wife, and she had 2 children by him who died in infancy before Hitler. He also had a younger brother die in childhood, but one of his younger sisters did survive, Paula. Now, his father also had 2 more children from a previous marriage, so in total, Hitler had 3 siblings, and he supposedly also had an incestuous relationship with one of their children, so that's the rumor anyway. This is the kind of family tree that grows in the center of a trailer park. His father was also a wanderer. He retired at the age of 58 when Hitler was 6 years old. And then for the next 5 years, the family moved from city to city or village to village around the city of Linz. So he had 7 changes of addresses in 5 years. And you can see why someone like this, who's always moving around, might be desperate to belong to something, even if it is eventually the Aryan race. No, don't have any sympathy with Hitler. No sympathy with Hitler here, okay? Now, Adolf Hitler's father paid money that he didn't really have to send young Hitler to a high school in Linz because he wanted his son to become a civil servant like him. But Hitler didn't want that. He didn't like the paperwork like that. And being a civil servant is mostly paperwork. So Hitler wanted to become an artist, and he stopped studying in school and he failed out. He didn't like academics or academia later on in his career either. He expresses a lot of contempt for the academy, for universities and stuff like this. Now, he did have one teacher that inspired him, a man by the name of Dr. Leopold Putsch, who was a fanatical German nationalist. And Hitler writes in Mein Kampf that Putsch made history his favorite subject. And you say teachers don't make a difference, but look here. Look at Dr. Putsch and his most famous pupil, Hitler. Hitler even went to visit his old teacher in 1938. I think that is beautiful. I mean, how many of you even brought your teacher an apple? And here Hitler is delivering this man Germany and also nearly turning it to ashes. Maybe the apple would have been better. I'm just saying you can make a difference in these kids' lives. That's all I'm saying. So Hitler dropped out of high school and he didn't get a job. He sat around and he read books, which he could have done in high school and not wasted his parents' money, but that's just the kind of terrible son that he was. He applied for the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, but he just wasn't good enough, okay? They rejected him twice, and they actually advised him to apply for the architecture school because he showed more promise as an architecture artist. But he had never graduated high school, so that was kind of difficult for him. Now, you'll see a through line in Hitler's life of his unwillingness to compromise. Even when it hurts him, even when it sabotages him, he will not compromise. Now, he also wouldn't get a job. His mom paid for all of his bills, and she worked herself nearly until she died of breast cancer. She did die of breast cancer, but she worked nearly till the end. Now, who helped Hitler's mother during this time? A Jewish doctor named Eduard Bloch, who gave the Hitlers free or reduced cost care. Now, Hitler later called this man a noble Jew, and he let him live. Now, we are not going to psychoanalyze Hitler here because, no, it does not make any sense to know a very good man who helped your mother in her time of need and then try to exterminate that man's entire race. In a Hollywood movie, Hitler would have learned the error of his ways or rejected anti-Semitism when he came across them later in life. But the real world does not work like a Hollywood movie. It doesn't make sense like a Hollywood movie. Hitler was devastated by his mother's death. Dr. Bloch said he never met a man so prostrate with grief. His mother had supported his artistic ambitions, unlike his father. Hitler said that he honored his father, but he loved his mother. Anyway, so Hitler is 19 when his mother dies, and he is broke with no way to earn a living because he doesn't have a trade. He first moved to Vienna, where he drifted around in poverty, taking odd jobs and frequenting the soup kitchens there. Hitler said that he could not stand the multiculturalism of the city, but broke people say crazy kinds of hater stuff, and Hitler was the king of broke haters. Envy actually informs his worldview. So after Vienna, he moved to Munich in 1913, and then World War I broke out in 1914. He begged to join the Bavarian regiment, And this was the twist of fate that allowed Hitler to escape his peasant upbringing. Plus, World War I upended the entire European world order. So yes, Hitler was born just over the border with Germany, so he does not have German nationality. He didn't have German nationality, but he gets the idea in his head that he is basically German and that there should be a greater Germany where what makes you a citizen is your Germanness. Well, actually, your Aryan blood, okay, meaning that you were genetically German, because plenty of Jews fought in World War I and made great advances for the sciences and the arts in Germany, and they spoke German, but that didn't save them from the gas chambers. Their Germanness was taken from them because in the eugenics worldview, your blood was what mattered most, not your passport, it was your blood. Now, Hitler did not invent the eugenics worldview. It was part of the early 1900s cultural milieu. Now, Hitler joined the army and earned 2 Iron Crosses for bravery. Germany ended up surrendering in 1918. They signed the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, but it was not on the most favorable terms, and the Allies were a little crueler than they had to be there. Now, this really disturbed Hitler, who felt that Germany had been betrayed and he blamed it on the Jews. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the Jews. It's never the Jews. Unless we're talking about a bagel shop, the Jews are not responsible. They just are not responsible. But apparently, Hitler was always doing these little monologues in the trenches of World War I about the Jews this and the Jews that. He was like a talking head, but in the trenches. Now, Hitler comes out of the First World War feeling betrayed, though he wasn't, nor was Germany. They just lost, and they couldn't accept that L because there were no Allied boots in Berlin. Well, wait a few years, guys, there will be. Now, the irony of Soviet boots in Berlin after World War II, when it was the Germans who sent Lenin back to Russia to destroy it and take down the Tsar and get them out of World War I. So ironic. I wonder if Germany wishes it was dealing with the Tsar in 1945 instead of Stalin. Maybe it would have still been Tsar Nicholas, but I would take any Tsar to Joseph Stalin. If I were given the choice of a man and a bear in the woods, of course I'm going to take the man. But if that man is Joseph Stalin, I am going with the bear. I'm going with the bear every day. So do you think there was an old German in Berlin who kind of noted that irony just before the Soviets killed him? Like, oh, this is ironic. And then he dies. His last words, famous last words. So let me know in the comments if you have a theory on that or if you just appreciate a good cosmic joke that costs 20 million lives. So back to Hitler in 1918, a young man of 29, and he's doing really well in the army by peasant standards. They continued his employment after the war, and he got a job at the Press and News Bureau of the political department of the Army's District Command because the German army was deep into conservative politics at this time. It even gave its soldiers courses on political instruction. Hitler excelled. He excelled at these. He really stood out in class, particularly for his anti-Semitic tirades. See, he just needed to find his niche. He was so good at his job that he was posted to a Munich regiment as an educational officer whose job it was to combat subversive ideas like pacifism and socialism and democracy. And we all know how much Hitler hated those things. But you might say, wasn't Germany a democracy at this time? Yes, it was the Weimar Republic, but the army was kind of mad about it. They didn't like the Republic. The people blamed the Republic for capitulating at the end of World War I and signing the Treaty of Versailles. That is not true. That's not exactly what happened, by the way. But a lot of Germans saw the Weimar Republic as just kind of weak. Many in the military not so secretly longed for a return to the monarchy. Anyway, Hitler got to speak in his new assignment, and he got to express his ideas against Marxism and against democracy, and of course, against the Jews. And this really was a comeback story because Hitler had feared that his voice had been damaged in the gas attacks in World War I. But he did find his voice. He did find his voice. Aw. No, we're going to stop awing Hitler. We're going to stop, okay? I kid you not, the story of Adolf Hitler kind of shines an unflattering light on the positivity movement because we don't need to encourage everyone to speak even if their voice shakes. Now, Paul Johnson makes a very good point in this book in modern times. At the beginning of World War I was the end of the era of kings and queens and the beginning of the era of democracy. Now, as we know from Plato, of course we read Plato, democracy usually descends into mob rule. And who rules the mob? The loudest voice. So we think, oh, monarchs are so evil, the aristocracy is so bad, let's get your average Joe. Well, what if that average Joe is Joseph Stalin? People actually thought that history was over in the beginning of the 1900s, and then it was just smooth sailing from there. But bam, what did we have? The two bloodiest wars we had ever seen. A lot of people call them one war split into two. And of course, those culminated with the Holocaust. The end of the monarchy allowed for regular people who could influence others to rise to the top, no matter what their social class was. We saw this all over the 20th century, but that is its own video. Anyway, back to Hitler. The army's political department assigned Hitler to check out a new group called the German Workers' Party. This party would later become known as the National Socialists or the Nazi Party, and the rest is history. Okay, so that is a very, very brief overview of Hitler's early life. How did this young man who got most of his political training in the army use that to rise to the top of the German government with this small little party? Up next is an overview of how Hitler used the media of his day to rise to the top and stay there for 12 tragic years. We will not be talking about those 12 tragic years, just how he got to the top. Now, in early 1920s Germany had a lot of political parties from all across the spectrum. There was no guarantee that the German Workers' Party was going to break out and become something big at all. There was no inkling that they were going to become what they became. Okay, they were very, very fringe, and there were a lot of fringe parties like them. By July 1933, the National Socialists, which had been the German Workers' Party, was the only acceptable party, but that was completely inconceivable in 1920. The most dominant party was the Social Democrats, who had stabilized the government after the end of World War I. Now, everybody was mad at them. The Conservatives, which was also a huge party, and the military wanted the monarchy back. And the communists were a huge party, and they wanted a Soviet-style state. Now, the Social Democrats, they got blamed for Versailles, which ended World War I, but Germany was mad at them for it, even though they didn't do it. Germany could not win that war. The Social Democrats were the major backing of the Weimar Republic, which everyone trash talked at that time. But the Weimar Republic actually wasn't so bad. It's just very easy to trash talk the party in power. And that's kind of the job of the fringe party. That's kind of the job of the influencer. It is the job of the influencer to criticize. And this is why we don't want influencers actually in charge. Now, this is the setting for the German Workers' Party in the early 1920s, a far-right, maybe sort of kinda socialist party that hated the Jews and believed in the superiority of German blood. I say sort of kinda socialist because in the early days there was a fight from within the party as to which way they would go. And a lot of Germans joined thinking that this was a socialist party, or at least that they were sympathetic to socialism. It was called the German Workers' Party after all. I mean, come on. Now, but Hitler was not about to let that happen, and he ended up murdering the people in the party who leaned socialist. Now, he only murdered them after he didn't need them anymore. That is for another video, but just remember that in 1920, Hitler was a nobody, and he would take all the help he could get. But even before Hitler, Germany had thugs interfering with politics. Yes, Hitler eventually had the brown shirts, but Hitler did not invent political thuggery in Germany. In the 1920s, the army low-key backed these volunteer military units called Freikorps, who were made up of former soldiers from World War I. Now, a coalition of right-wingers backed by the Freikorps was able to occupy Berlin and attempt to form a right-wing government in the famous Kampf Putsch. Now, the Republican government fled and the army did nothing. The army didn't do anything. It was a general strike by the workers that restored the Republic then. Also, there was a minor Soviet-style communist revolution that took power in Bavaria around this time as well. Thugs were able to push out the elected government for a short time there as well. So the fight between the far right and the communists was very real in early 1920s Germany. It wasn't just ideas. So when you think later about Hitler, when we think in hindsight about Hitler, where does this guy get the to do what he did? Remember that the German government was chaotic, and it was conceivable that a person with enough chutzpah and an army could put himself in power, especially if he could put aside or put down those pesky trade unions which stopped the Kampf push. The United States is much more stable, and it has been since our founding. So I'm only clarifying so you don't look at this from the lens of the 21st century America and think, how did they let this happen? Now, their system is not like ours, and they didn't have the love and devotion for democracy that we actually have. In fact, a portion of them did want to return to the monarchy. These people actually wanted a king. Now, not all Germans wanted to ditch democracy, but the military did, and wherever the military goes, the people go too, because the military can kill us, and people don't want to get shot. We ask, why didn't the Germans resist more after Hitler takes power? Well, those who tried got shot or beaten or run out of town or sent to the camps, which were initially made for the people who disagreed with the Nazis. Thuggery masked in legality actually worked to silence these people. So thuggery is very effective. And you might think history is more complex than that, but it often comes down to people just not wanting to get their asses beat. So back to young Hitler. He goes to a meeting for the German Workers' Party. This is a story from the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Now, apparently, Hitler found the meeting to be boring in general, but someone stood up and suggested that South Germany form a new country with Austria. This enraged Hitler, and Hitler pulled a Hitler. Now, for the record, pulling a Hitler means he went on a long, angry tirade in which he berated the other side and their pitiful ideas. Hitler was not a compromising man, even when he was powerless. In fact, Hitler became Hitler by pulling many Hitlers, just crushing his opponents in speeches until he was the last man standing. Now, at this meeting, this tirade won over many people, including a man named Anton Dexler, one of the party's founders, who accepted Hitler into the German Workers' Party. Hitler hadn't even applied. In fact, Hitler wanted to form his own party, not join this piddly little party, but he went to another meeting and thought, what's the worst thing that could happen? Man, did he answer that question by 1945. Okay, so Hitler's like, YOLO, and he joins this party. It's already got a few goons, very good goons, by the way, and some of the administration work figured out. So he takes over this party instead of starting from scratch. Shirer calls this party a weird assortment of misfits, and that's true because these were not professional people. Hitler was a failed artist and an army propagandist, and then there's Ernst Röhm, who was a scrappy homosexual covered in scars, and he was a socialist. This will come up later. Remember, Hitler didn't actually like socialists. He didn't really care if you were a homosexual as long as you were beating up communists. Now, later, of course, Hitler persecuted homosexuals along with other undesirables, and he sent them to camps. But the Nazis were notorious for allowing gays in the brown shirts early on as long as those gays could scrap. And then there's this guy called Dietrich Eckart, a failed poet and writer, but a very successful racist. Now, he was older and he was kind of like a mentor to Hitler. Now we have also Rudolf Hess, who was an OG member of the party, and Alfred Rosenberg, who both stayed with Hitler until the end of the war. Now, this would make a great Britcom if it didn't end in the Holocaust, but you see why a lot of people fail to even know that they should stop the Nazis. They just never thought that it could happen. But it did happen. It did happen. And Hitler's ability to publicize himself and his organization are how it happened. Plus, he got some major swings of luck. Now, in 1920, Hitler left the army so he could focus on the party full time. He took over the party's propaganda and he organized this huge meeting for February 24th, 1920. And of course, he let everybody know that he organized it. He was not the type of guy to not take credit for these things. Everybody had to know it was Hitler who did this. At the meeting, Hitler articulates the 25-point program of the party, but communists and socialists show up and they clash with far-right goons. Kind of like Antifa and the Proud Boys clashing, but it's a different era. It's just to show you an example of street fighting. The points were actually a mixture of nationalism and socialism. And the first point was that there should be a union of all Germans into a greater Germany. This will be Nazi justification for aggressive wars later on. Now, some of the points were straight up socialist, like the abolition of incomes on unearned work, the abolishing of the land rent, the death penalty for usurers. Now, there is a reason that people joined the Nazi Party thinking that they were socialists, because the points were literally socialist. But they also wanted a strong central power of the state. Under Hitler, of course. Now, they changed their name from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler also designed their logo, the swastika on the red background. Now, this is branding. I will talk a lot of trash about the Nazis, but I will never come for their look. The swastika is one of the best logos ever. Imagine if Hitler were born in 1989 and he's designing shoes and hating on Jews in secret. What a difference a century makes. Anyway, I shouldn't call him a failed artist because that brand logo is absolutely iconic. The symbol is called the Hakenkreuz in German, and it is ancient, going all the way back to Indian relics. Now, in Germany, it had previously been used for the Eckhart Brigade during the 1920 Kampf Putsch in Berlin. So yes, Hitler borrowed it, but he did make it his own. Also, as much as I admire the look, it was the last thing that many people saw before they died, and it struck fear into people who saw it for decades to come. It was really horrible for them, which I think is what he was going for. Anyway, by 1921, Hitler took over party leadership. Dexler, who had initially recruited Hitler, called him a would-be dictator and a demagogue in a pamphlet that they distributed. Now, Hitler threatened to sue for libel, and the authors backed down. Well, it turns out Hitler was a demagogue, but he bluffed them with that libel suit threat. Now, Hitler will bluff you. Remember that. He bluffed the whole of Western Europe later. But at this time, in 1921, he bullied other members of the party and became the dictator within this party, which is what they accused him of doing. Now, he had this whole party apparatus working for him and him alone. He was the Nazi Party, and they were him. Now, in 1923, the Nazi Party got their own daily newspaper called the Völkischer Beobachter, which basically means folk observer. Now, this was kind of their blog where the party could plead their case directly to the people. It was their pulpit. And a lot of these small parties had their own daily newspaper back then. I do not want to make this a 2-hour video, so I will skip ahead to the Beer Hall Putsch and how Hitler was able to parlay that into more fame for himself, even though it failed. Now, in 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome and seized power for the fascists there. Hitler was inspired. Look what this little Italian has done, he says to himself, and he puts it on his vision board. If Mussolini can seize power, why can't Hitler? I don't think he literally had a vision board. That's just a figure of speech. He admired him is what I'm trying to say. Maybe he had a vision board in his heart. On November 8th, 1923, Hitler, backed by the famed General Ludendorff and Rome's armed thugs, the SA, they attempted to kidnap the leadership of Bavaria and force them to form a new government. Now, at first, the men said no. The politicians said no. But Hitler went back into the beer hall and he told the crowd that they had said yes, and the crowd cheered. So the politicians did eventually say yes. See, Hitler captures his audience. He is not audience captured. Now, side note on audience capture here. See, Hitler captures the audience and the audience captures the politicians, the rulers of Bavaria. Now, if we're rocks, paper, scissoring the concept of will, great man beats audience, audience beats regular men beat great men. That's not a real game. I think it might be in history, though. It might be like a game that the gods have thought up to be like, hey, let's play this and see how many people we can get to die. Note here also that Hitler was a liar, a straight up liar. Most people would be ashamed to do something like that, but Hitler did lie to get what he wanted, and he will do it again many times after this. So, Hitler has taken the leaders of Bavaria at the beer hall, and he convinces them to agree to form a new government, but at gunpoint. Then he leaves to settle a disturbance, thus removing that gunpoint. The politicians are able to slip away, and the putsch fails. Hitler and 3,000 stormtroopers, formerly soldiers mostly, they then try to march to Munich's city center, but they are stopped by the police. And there is a shootout where 16 Nazis die and 3 police officers are also killed. Hitler was arrested and put on trial. See, this trial is where the legend of Hitler is born. It is his breakout moment. Instead of begging for mercy, Hitler pulls a Samuel L. Jackson, yes, they deserve to die, and I hope they burn in hell. But not that line. And of course, Hitler is the villain. So just that vibe, that courtroom vibe he brought, okay? He did not back down. He defended his actions, that they were right to do even if they were not legal. Now, the papers picked up on it, and this got Hitler a lot of the attention he so craved. We see that where there are newspapers for sale, we have an attention economy. Kind of a cruder version of the attention economy that we have right now. This is influencer Hitler seeing this attention economy and exploiting it to advance himself and by extension advance his Nazi party. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years, of which he served 9 months in a country club of a prison at the old fortress in Landsberg. Now, of course, Hitler wasn't going to say that it was a country club with nice views where he got gifts and treats. He isn't going to say this. He's an opportunist, or he was an opportunist. He took those 9 months to write his autobiography, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Dude, what struggle? My elementary school was tougher than that prison, but whatever. Mein Kampf was published in 2 volumes, one in 1925 and the other in 1926, but it was later combined into a single version, a single volume that was released. But this book, Mein Kampf, was not only propaganda for Hitler and the Nazis, but it was also merch. Hitler was finally able to make a living, a small living, as a writer from the sales of this book, and Germans kind of respected writers at this time. The audience wanted juicy details of the Beer Hall Putsch, so many of the publishers in Germany actually wanted to publish Hitler's book. Now, Mein Kampf really wasn't about the putsch. In fact, he used the book as an opportunity to create the myth of Hitler. Sales were not great, but they were more than he was making before. Remember, he wasn't making much money before this at all. No, I am not going to go into Thomas Sowell's theories on intellectuals and society, okay? We don't have time right now. We just don't have time for it. We're talking about Hitler. Now, of course, after Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Mein Kampf sold 5 million copies. Hitler became a millionaire, and this isn't unusual for politicians, by the way. They make a lot of money by their book sales. It's still going on today, even today. Now, after 1933, Mein Kampf was required reading, or more accurately, it was required decoration for Nazi homes, and Nazis pretended that they read it. It was the blueprint for the Third Reich, and it spelled out a strong pan-German state with a powerful figure as leader. Now, who should that powerful figure be? Why, Hitler, of course, the Führer. The Führer. Now, in Mein Kampf, Hitler gave his views on ideas that were already floating around in the cultural milieu of Germany. The German people, he said, were the Volk, which is a term that kind of translates into the soul of the people, which is carried through the blood, a rough translation. It includes their history and their art and their destiny. And this was a very popular idea at the time. He also spelled out his concept of Lebensraum, or living space to the east, as in, hey, we should conquer the east. Says it pretty clearly. So we will go into Nazi philosophy more in Rate My Cult, and you will see how Hitler was able to take concepts from the cultural milieu and claim ownership of them, even from a prison cell. Now, after the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler vows against going outside the Constitution ever again, and he never does. Well, he kind of does for the murders, like the Night of the Long Knives. He does then. However, Hitler learns a valuable lesson, which is that it is better to have the law on your side. So from his release in 1924 until his rise to absolute power in 1933, Hitler kept it legal and within the parameters of constitutional law. In fact, all those murders, the whole Holocaust, is technically legal. He did it legally. I know. That's crazy, but it's true. I'm not lying to you here. The Nuremberg laws. We're not going to go into that in this video, but they made sure that it was legal. You should watch that movie Conspiracy to see how they can say, well, it's legal. Okay, so why were the German people so receptive to Hitler's message? One thing I do have to point out is that the Nazi Party was not getting that many seats in the Reichstag prior to the global financial crisis of 1929. That hit Germany really, really hard. Hitler promised change. He promised to fix the economy. He promised to fix society, to undo the shackles of Versailles, to push back the changing economic system. He promised to rid Germany of global capitalists and Marxists, which were both somehow code words for Jews. They were doing both things at once. He would have promised anything because Hitler was a liar and an opportunist, and he would say whatever he had to say to get power. But the people, a lot of the people, actually believed him. Did Germans know he meant Jews when he said global capitalists and Marxists? That he'd rid them of these social parasites? Or did they just care about the economy? That is open for debate. Now, some scholars say that the Germans were the most anti-Semitic people ever, so they really elected Hitler to do what they always wanted to do. We'll talk about that in the Ordinary Men video. Others say, hey, it's the economy, stupid. They just wanted to lower the price of eggs. Keep in mind that in free and fair elections, the Nazis never got a majority. They never got more than 37% of the vote. Through complex wheeling and dealings, not through the ballot box, is how Hitler was able to get himself named chancellor in 1933. And the rest is history. A terrible, awful, horrific history. Now, I know this has been long, and you're probably very confused about the feelings you're having about Adolf Hitler right now. You're like, wait a minute, am I rooting for this guy? And that's just because we're trained to root for the underdog. It's really a baffling origin story, but the proof is in the pudding, and Hitler's pudding tastes like ashes and sewage, which is the state he left Germany in when he died. So to sum it up, Hitler was born at a time when the monarchies were dying and some upstart could rise to the top. Hitler showed little promise in school, very little promise in school, except in art, but he was able to join the army and get propaganda training there. The army sent him to scope out this little party, which he joined and then took over. He was also able to get his own newspaper. He attempted to overthrow the government of Bavaria, and when that failed, he maximized that attention to make himself a celebrity and to write a book about himself. Get that merch. And then in 1929, the markets crashed, and he was ruthless enough to play German politics and get himself into power. Power is the key word here. Hitler wanted it, and he weaponized attention to get it. One very important note. In the 1920s, Hitler used a combination of soft power, like propaganda and speeches, and hard power, like Rome's SA. These are thugs, the brown shirt thugs, to get his way. Then he added constitutional power as another means to get his way until he became chancellor and controlled the real power in Germany. The military, the police, the guns. This is real power. And after that, if someone didn't agree with Hitler, they got sent to Dachau. And there were many people who did not agree with Hitler. The first inmates in concentration camps were not Jews, but political opponents and anyone who spoke out against the Nazis. Now, I saw a video the other day of what did the German people know about the Holocaust after the death marches in 1944. And yes, they probably did know, but their last chance to stop it, to really stop it, was in 1932, because once Hitler came to power, he used straight up violence to subjugate the German people and keep them from forming any real opposition to the Nazis. Now, I forget who said it, but they said Germany was the first country that the Nazis invaded. And I felt that. That's rough. Now, this is the shortest story of Hitler's rise ever. It's a story that thousands upon thousands of pages have been written on. This is just a short YouTube video. If you want to learn more, please read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Or if you have Netflix, there's this really great documentary on it from 1977 called Hitler, A Career. And there is also a BBC documentary, which is just fantastic. Thank you, and stay tuned for more videos about Hitler and the Nazis. Happy fall of the Third Reich, everybody!